Well, it is really nice. I sincerely mean it's really nice to be here. And every time I hear this band and gather with you, I'm just reminded how wonderful this service is. And I miss being in here more often. So my first time to really be in your new space. It's gorgeous. I know there's a few kinks, but it's really working well. This is wonderful. Well, I want to start with a story, and I have a confession to make because, thank you, my timer. I have to confess, I stole this story from Tom. And so that means a lot of you probably heard it, but here's my theory. Stories bear repeating, so you're going to hear it again if you've heard it. If not, I like it. So here it is. It's the story of Nasrudin and the king. Nasrudin and the king were constantly engaged in challenging with one another in solving riddles. Now, it had just started with a game, and as the riddles got more difficult over time, it seemed that Nasrudin was always the one who was solving the riddles, which really angered the king. It embarrassed him. It frustrated him. It humiliated him. He didn't like it. It had to stop. So the king devised a plan. He would find the most difficult riddle in the world, a challenge that was impossible to solve. And if Nasrudin couldn't solve it within an hour, he would be put to death. Nasrudin, my friend, said the king, if you can solve this riddle by the time the sun sets, I will declare you the most clever man in the kingdom. But if not, you will be put to death and labeled a failure. Nasrudin was beside himself. What had happened to this simple game between friends that had led to this? It was just a game. The king presented the riddle. He took a stick and he drew a line in the sand about 15 inches long. Nasrudin, you've heard it, without touching that line in any way, you must make it shorter. You have 1 hour before sunset to solve this riddle or die. Now, the crowd that had gathered there to watch this gasped because they looked at it and thought, there's no way to make a line in the sand shorter unless somehow you touch it. Even if you blow on it or do something, but you've got to touch it in some way. You cannot shorten a line in the sand without touching it. And you know what they thought? They thought the king has tricked him. The king has become unfair, a tyrant, and they hated and feared him now. Nasrudin got really still, and after a minute, he picked up the stick that the king had used. No, said the king, you can't use a stick. Nasrudin thought a little longer, took the stick. He drew a second line in the sand, about 20 inches long. Stood back, looked at the king and said, Sir, your line is shorter. Let's start with a quick prayer. Gracious God, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be rooted and grounded in your love. Amen. David and Goliath. Now, if you've never been to church, never opened a Bible, never been to Sunday school, you probably still know the story of David and Goliath. I was just, in the last couple of weeks, thinking about this, and I've heard 4 references to it just by going about my normal day-to-day stuff. It's a common story of an underdog winning the battle. But I want to challenge that and say it's not really an underdog story. It's a story of being able to see things from a different perspective. I think we could call that seeing through the eyes of God. And when we do that, it opens up all kinds of possibilities we could not see before. So let's start with this imposing giant Goliath, one of the Philistines terrorizing the Israelite army. He's a huge man, and Well, okay, a side note here. He's not as huge as when I used to think about this story as a kid, because when you said giant to me, I thought Jack and the Beanstalk. One day in second grade, we were told that a giant was going to come visit our school. I think the circus was in town. And we all went out to the playground because, of course, you know, a giant wouldn't fit inside our building. And when we went outside, now I'm second grade, and I'm looking up, thinking there's going to be a giant head come over the top of my 2-story school building and look down on us and be very imposing. And all of a sudden, I see my principal walking around the corner with this really tall, skinny, 9-foot man, and I thought, well, that's a disappointment. Anyway, that's not the kind of giant we have here. Not a great big one, but this guy is still really, really imposing. He's described as 6 cubits in a span. That's about 10 feet tall. And he was so strong that he was wearing bronze gear that weighed about 250 pounds and carrying this huge, heavy, demonic javelin that was slung back between his shoulder blades, had a big skull on the end of it. That's quite a sight, don't you think? I'd be scared. And then there's little David. Now, if you read the whole story, that's how he's always referred to, little David. Little David, just a boy. Little David bringing food to his older brothers in the battlefield. Little David, whose brothers made fun of him and told him to shut up whenever he tried to speak. Little David, who heard the roar of the most imposing man he had ever seen and quickly volunteered to do what the king and no other soldier would do. Little David, who knew that when it came to facing giants, you have to see things in a completely new way. So, you know what that Nazarene story and this story of David and Goliath have in common? They both speak of the ability to see beyond what seems obvious. They both involve characters who can see options when there appears to be no other options, the possible and the impossible. And they both understood that the normal, traditional ways of the world that are responding to things that threaten us, those ways won't work here. We have to look for a different way to live. I know you're all familiar, or most of you familiar with the saying from Albert Einstein. I'm going to paraphrase it a bit, change it. We cannot solve a problem with the same kind of thinking or seeing that got us there in the first place. When facing giants, we have to see things differently. King Saul didn't. Neither did any of those other soldiers. The normal and expected response to the challenge or a threat of a big giant was go head to head, take up weapons, use brute force. And in this case, as in so many others, if you can't see beyond the age-old, time-worn, normal ways of responding, the ways of the world, then you're going to end up hopeless, which is what those soldiers were. They were frozen with hopelessness, seeing it as impossible. But seeing things in a new way, seeing things through the eyes of God, that changes things dramatically. The possibilities become unimaginable. We cannot face the giants of this world with the same kind of thinking or understanding or seeing that helped create them in the first place, can we? We're just chasing our tails. We live in a world of giants, don't we? Things that are oppressive, insurmountable, hopeless. And I'll be honest, I don't watch a lot of news anymore. Now, I'm not suggesting that we stay ignorant. It's tempting. That we need to stay well informed, not avoiding bad news and putting on those Pollyanna rose-colored glasses. Not that. That's irresponsible. But I simply have learned that I cannot inundate myself with what feels so heavy and oppressive and impossible because I start to feel hopeless and frozen and I can't see a way out. So when I do that, I feel like those soldiers looking across the river at this enormous giant screaming and taunting. I mean, how are we going to go up against the giants that threaten our environment and have already done so much damage? How do we do that? How do we go up against the giants who threaten the nations with weapons of mass destruction? We're small, like David. How do we go up against the giants of poverty, of violence, of meaninglessness, of hunger, of war, and all the myriad of giants that war spawns, like starvation, seething rage, orphaned children, vengeance? Are we feeling overwhelmed yet? When we're overwhelmed, when we are afraid, fear brings out the worst in us. Fear makes us lose perspective, makes us lose faith in a future of hope that God does always hold out in front of us. Fear makes us unable to see the possibilities or even believe that we can make a difference because we're just small. This story is not simply an underdog story of a little boy defeating a giant once upon a time. It is a story for all people who are called by God to be engaged in God's work. And you know what God's work is? God's work is to transform this world. To transform this world so that it looks like a kingdom that our God of compassion and mercy and justice and reconciliation reigns. Not as the world gives us. And that means we have to be a people who are not afraid to do things differently. We cannot succumb to despair and fear or retreat behind a religion that only asks us to be sure that our souls go to heaven when we die. The prophets called that too small a thing, way too small. We cannot keep doing things the way we always have and expect anything to be different in the long run. And I know you use these words in here a lot, but I'm going to read the quote from Martin Luther King Jr. when he said, "Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars." And then those words you sing in here so often. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can. We, people of faith, we have to understand that this world will never be healed by the same kind of thinking and living that created the pain in the first place. The oppressing giants of this world are not going to be allowed to define what is real and what is possible for us, are they? So is there a lesson here about how we're supposed to face these giants in our lives, in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our world? Can you, simple you, do anything that's going to make a difference in the transformation of this world into a place where God's children can live in peace? It's not a trick question. That's not a riddle. We have the answer right in front of us, and it is Jesus' own teachings and the way he lived his life, our example. In a world that says use force against force, violence against violence, anger against anger, there is Jesus commanding us one commandment, one, not 10, one, that you love. In a world filled with suffering, oppression, injustice, hunger, loneliness, and fear, Jesus offers a new perspective. Love. Now, doesn't that sound nice? Love, soft, cushy, sweet, cozy. That's not what Jesus meant. Jesus called us to a radical, decisive, complete, and demanding love that is hard. A love that is chosen with intention. You wake up every morning and say, regardless of how I feel or what I want to do, I will commit myself to love today. We have to dedicate ourselves to that with our whole being, and we have to dismantle our more instinctual, knee-jerk reactions of responding. That is a love that is very hard. And anything less, God's vision of peace and goodness for all creation will never be accomplished. I'm going to say that again. Anything less than a complete devotion to the kind of love that will heal this world, God's vision of peace and goodness for all creation will never be accomplished without that. In the Christian community, in this church, every Sunday at communion and every time a person decides to join this church, we ask them a series of questions, and one of them is, do you seek to live in peace with one another? And we ask that because it is at the heart of our calling as a community of faith. Do we seek to live in peace with one another, with this world, with ourselves? Those questions are not threats, but they are serious. They are questions that ask us to engage with God. Do we seek to love? That is the only way we will truly engage with God. I want to take a quick personal moment, if I may. Recently, Tom and I lost a very special friend who was a mentor and a role model for us. One who did not live perfectly, but did live very intentionally as a man of God. He was a United Methodist pastor, a professor who transformed the hearts of his students, including Tom's and mine. He was a missioner, as he called himself, standing up for the needs and the rights of those who would be among the least and the last in our world. Dr. Gil Farrell, a peacemaker, taught not just with words but with deeds what it means to be a Christian in this world. And I am sad to say that just prior to his death, so much of what he saw and read about Christianity in general and the United Methodist Church in particular, he saw as in danger of falling prey to fear rather than radical possibilities of compassion and love. Gil was a man who lived that kind of life. Let me give you some images of him. This is a man who walked in Selma in the turbulent 60s with the suffering ones in the oppressive South, facing threat and violence. This is a man who begged the church not to be satisfied with lovely sanctuaries and impressive church growth numbers at the expense of addressing the needs of those living in poverty. This is a man who was absolutely and deeply admired and respected, but never wanted the limelight. Just a quick illustration. He got a huge award one time. Thousands of people were gathered, and they all jumped to their feet, and he very humbly asked everyone to sit down and said this: "My mother always told me to beware of people who were bowing down before me. Don't assume they're adoring you," she said. "They might be about to pull the rug out from under you." This was a man who admired and encouraged his students, who had the depth of faith required to ask the hard questions, to seek truth even when it felt threatening. And this was a man whose heart genuinely bled for those who would be blocked from entering the doors of the church and offering their own lives and life commitments to the ways of peace because of their sexual orientation. This was a man who loved, radically loved. He was a David among Goliaths. And he knew that even though these giants may never be completely enslaved or slayed in his lifetime, he knew that he had no real other option of living if he couldn't dedicate his life to those purposes, because someday that would be accomplished. Will the giants be slain in our lifetimes? That's not ours to know. Only that we would commit ourselves to the ways of God and the ways of peace and a future of hope. We must be the ones who see a line in the sand and then see a possibility that nobody else can see. We must be the ones who pick up small rocks of love to fit into slingshots of mercy, that the terrorizing giants of this world might fall with a crashing thud. And we are the ones who will not succumb to hopelessness and despair, because we commit ourselves and all that we have to the ways of peace, all that the kingdom of God might truly come to earth.